Hey guys, how you doing? This is Mike McCormick with Advanced Criminology here in Owings Mills, Maryland. Tonight's discussion is a continuing of part 1 of why the shooting of Stephon Clark was unjustified. Now, if you didn't see part 1, please go please go see part 1 of this particular 2-part series here before you go to part 2. Because whatever information I'm giving in part 2 today is just I'm passing along from what I recorded and talked about in video number 1, part 1 of this particular case, and that will kind of bring you up to speed as to what's talked about here in part 2. And I advise that on all the videos that we put out here at Advanced Criminology. There's an order to what I've done. I've even numbered the videos so that you'll have that sequence. And this is this I don't know what number this is, 064. It should be this particular video, or 65. Either, at any event, there's an order to the videos, and you need to watch them in that order. Now, tonight's discussion, as I said before, is a continuance of what we talked about earlier. Now, there are a few things in these videos captured by the police helicopter and captured on the officer's body cam that really illuminate poor training on both the helicopter pilot and his spotter, as well as the officers on the ground. It seems that the officers, the spotters, are given a lot of information about this individual. At some points they say he's running and he's not, he's walking. At some point they say he had an object in his hand which was used to pry open windows, which upon further investigation revealed that that wasn't the case. He didn't have anything, a pry bar. And subsequent to that, he didn't have a handgun, as we all know. He had a cell phone in his hand. Now, it's my job here at Advanced Criminology to go back and review what I know to be true that happens on police departments behind the scenes, and then also to discuss some of the academic side, the paralegal side, if you will, of how things pretty much are supposed to play out with law enforcement and engaging in lethal force with the suspect. I'm also going to cover the body cam policy by the Sacramento Police Department. Excuse me. Here's a copy of it right here. I'll bring it to you closer so you can see it. It says Sacramento Police Department General Orders Body-worn camera as effective date as of 9/12/16. Okay, I'm going to show you that one. And then I'm going to show you Baltimore City. We'll come up to Baltimore City's policy. Policy 824, body-worn camera, 13 September 2017. This is actually 13 pages long. As you can see, it says it right here, 13 pages. Whereas Sacramento's is only 4 pages. Okay, and there's a distinction in a couple of issues in here that I will discuss and talk about, that you can see that they're both, in terms of police departments, are way off in terms of how they see the body-worn camera situation. Baltimore City seems to be pretty intense, and it covers more situational issues and accountability issues than the Sacramento policy on body-worn cameras. And since I'm talking about it, let me just go ahead and we'll just stay right there where we are. So for instance, there's a section in the Sacramento body-worn cameras that says this. It says employees are not required to give notice when they are recording and talking to private citizens during the course and scope of their official duties. So in terms of transparency, Sacramento Police Department's policy is not being transparent with the citizens when they approach them to discuss anything related to a particular crime situation or investigative situation, by acknowledging to that individual that, yes, you are being recorded. However, the Baltimore City body-worn camera on page 4 of 13 says that, except as otherwise exempted by law, members shall notify as soon as practicable the recorded individual that they are being recorded unless it is unsafe, impractical, or impossible to do so. And they give a format here for the officer to use, such as, hello, I am Officer so-and-so of Baltimore Police Department. I am advising you that the interaction is being recorded. They are doing this because they want to be transparent to the citizen that this confrontation that's about to take place between you and I is officially being recorded, so that there's something that's said by me or you that could be misinterpreted, we'll have it. If there's something I do or something you do to me or I to you, it can be recorded, and we can preserve that for future reference. Okay? So you're putting the citizen on notice because that helps sometimes to what? De-escalate a potential situation if an individual who is not going to conform, is going to be combative, maybe that individual, once they learn they're being recorded, their actions could change. As well as the police officer's actions. Once they realize that they are recording themselves in a situation, then they too will, act accordingly, if you will. So I just wanted to touch on those two body cam policies and how much they differ, where Sacramento is not transparent at all, and where Baltimore City is in this particular general order. Okay, moving on. We want to also update you in this particular video of the recent results of the private retained pathologists by the lawyers of Mr. Clark's family. Dr. Bennett Umalu, who is the pathologist in this case, did a forensic pathology investigation of Mr. Clark's body since he was killed, and it indicates that he received 4 shots to his lower back. He received 2 shots through the neck from the back. So that's a total of 6 shots that came from behind Mr. Clark. Then there was 1 shot in his armpit and another shot in his leg for a total of 8 shots. However, we all know that a total of 20 shots were fired, which means that 12 missed Mr. Clark entirely. Okay? The pathologist also indicates that the majority of those shots were lethal in nature. The ones in his lower back pretty much punctured his vertebrae and his lungs, okay, which means he would have certainly bled out quickly. And he was shot in the neck. Remember that he was shot in the neck twice in the back part of that area. So now we know that, and what's being reported from the police department is that this gentleman came towards the police officer. Again, here we go with the generic cookie cutter explanation that we keep hearing over and over again from police departments about an individual advancing towards an officer, and as a result of their advancement, they are suddenly shot dead. Okay, if I'm the in these situations with me talking about this as a former police officer, at some point you got to look back and say, you know what? Let's keep it real here. You can have a couple of incidents where you have individuals that lunge towards you, but every single incident should not be replicated in the same fashion in terms of testimony and in terms of how the incident unfolded. Where every time that we see these cases, it says that an individual came forward. Now, this kid was running away from the police, if we recall, from the very beginning. We also know that even when he was confronted, he was told a couple of commands, which I will tell you in terms of training, when you give individuals commands, you can't give them too many commands too fast because they get confused and will not understand what you're talking about. So that's a training issue in and of itself. And you had to contend with, I'm sure, the helicopter noise up above, which probably, if you have never been in situations like this, where when I was in the military and I was stationed on an air base, as a matter of fact. So I will tell you, when helicopters are close by and landing, you can't hear a damn thing. So to say, even when I was on the police department and the local helicopter would be in the area, if he came lower, flew lower, you cannot hear each other talk. It was barely hard for me to even understand what was going on the police radio. So, we don't know whether or not that's why Mr. Clark reacted the way he did. We just know what we saw. And what we saw in my estimation, was an individual receiving a couple of commands. Now, if you tell me, and if I'm wrong, then I would hope that the officers that are out there, former or current officers, would tell me that if you say put your hands up universally, that means, and I'm going to demonstrate, and I'm going to have my cell phone in my hand, that my hands go straight up. If you say to me, let me see your hands, that's a whole different command, because now you're asking me to extend my hands so you can see them. And there's my hands right here. And there's a cell phone right here. So I don't understand where we get to show me your hands to a lunge. Now, this is what's going on behind the scenes and has already gone on since the 18th of March. The supervisors are trying to get these officers' stories together. The Fraternal Order of Police is weighing in behind the scenes to make sure that these officers can write a justifiable homicide report. And so you have to include in that narrative, when you write that report, that individual had moved in your direction where you thought that he had a handgun, and any closer in his movement to you made you subject to lethal force by that individual where you could be killed. And so therefore you had a fear for losing your life. That is a testimony that is always given in court proceedings. If the officer never utters these words, I was in fear of my life, it is an entire different case. I challenge any prosecutor, any former prosecutor to tell me otherwise, that officer must say those words. If he does not or she does not say those words in a jury trial or in a court trial in front of a judge, that they were in fear of their life, then that case is an unjustified homicide. Clean and simple. Once again, if there's a challenge, please, one thing I love is for those in law enforcement, those in the criminal justice system, to certainly respond back through the comments section so we can go back and forth. I'm going to bring my evidence. I want you to bring yours too. Or send me to where, if you want me to read some information that you have, you send it to my email address and I'll comment then, and we'll go back and forth on email as far as I'm concerned. Moving on. The autopsy supports more of the theory, if you will, that the individual's back was turned when he was shot. It would be impossible for him to lunge forward if the shots came from the weapons of the officers where the individual had been turned around and he was shot in the back. Shot in the back is what it says, shot in the back. So we can't make it something that it isn't. And it seems like the Sacramento Police Department is trying to lean that way. And I would encourage the police chief, certainly at this point, to review the documentation submitted so far by the officers in this case and their supervisors, because that's where this information is coming from. It's coming from the officer's direct supervisor, who may not have been on the scene at the time. So he's just listening to what the officer's account is on the ground and the officers who were operating the helicopter above. So that's what you have. Now, and also you need to know that the police commissioner in Sacramento is a new police commissioner who is black. Okay. However, we're dealing with the law. We're dealing with lethal force. And it's the same no matter whether an officer is black, white, whatever color that he or she is. If you violate your own policies in terms of lethal force, it does not matter. A young man is dead behind this situation. And again, it's a reoccurrent theme that's running through the majority of police departments in this country about how and when to use lethal force. Again, it's a training issue, and I can't stress that enough, that the academies are going to have to come up with a way to train real time about these incidences. If you're going to train officers, you might as well put them in scenarios, just like the military does. You put them in scenarios in areas where you can train at nighttime with firearms and you can train during the day. And quite naturally, you don't use real ammunition. Everybody knows that when it comes to training. But you got to put them in scenarios like this and create the conditions such as helicopter sounds, other sirens and things like that, because that all goes to a person's mindset when they are in a confrontation with a potential suspect. All this is psychology stuff. All of this is talked about, been written about for years in law enforcement. I'm sitting here saying nothing new. And I want you folks to know that if you go back and you start looking at some of the literature that's out there, that's been out there for over 20 years, they've always talked about the psychological issues that go along with police officer shootings, those issues, psychological issues that lead up to the shooting, and those that, follow the shooting, the PTSD type situations. So the literature is out there. It's one thing about criminal justice, it's widely written about, trust me, widely written about. So that's just food for thought if you guys really want to go out there and research certain stuff. Okay. Let's go back to the terms justified and unjustified. Of course, we know that justify means just what it says, that it meets all the criteria for it to be legally done. Okay, if it's unjustified, it does not meet all the criteria for it to be legally done. So it's unjustified. Now, there are two things that go on with the police-involved shootings. There are two things that happen. One is going to be a criminal investigation should the police investigation lead in a direction where there could be criminal charges filed against the two officers. The other is the internal affairs investigation, and that is designed to look at whether or not those two officers, as well as the helicopter officers or any other officers on the ground who responded to that scene that evening, were in violation of departmental rules and policy. Herein is where you can be sanctioned from a slap on the hand to losing your job. And most officers, if not all, understand that particular issue when the internal affairs investigation takes place. And they have a right to either remain silent or they can speak. In most cases, they are required, based upon the rules and regulations set out with individual fraternal order of police around the country, and some of them fall under different types of names. But it is designed so that officer can make a statement to that particular body without making a statement to the state's attorney's office. And as long as the state's attorney's office is not investigating this case, the officer doesn't have to talk to anyone from the state's attorney's office. They'll have to go through the fraternal order of police, if that's going to be the case, his representative, to talk to him or her. So that's what's going on behind the scenes in this particular case. One thing I'll have to commend the attorney for the Clarks is that Mr. Crump automatically, and this is an experienced man, he's learned a few lessons representing prior families in 4 or 5 other police-related shootings over the past couple of years. And I think what he's finally come to see is that he doesn't want to rely on the autopsy report from the police department and the local coroner's office or pathologist's office. What he wants to do, and what he did do, is he hurry up and had his pathologist do a pathology investigation on the body of Mr. Clark to make the determination, which I read earlier in the video, about where those rounds hit the gentleman that were fired from the police officers. And so he's really one up against the police, because the police department typically would probably not release information like that for weeks, in some cases months. And what he's done, he's forced the police department's hand now, because they have to come back with their autopsy. Now, I will tell you, they can't come back with an autopsy that's totally diametrically opposed to what his autopsy revealed. It's just impossible for 2 forensic pathologists in this particular case with 8 rounds in the body, the same body that Sacramento pathologist is going to look at, and say completely 2 different scenarios. It would be impossible. But I can't wait to hear what they have to say. So I wanted to share the latest stuff with you guys out there about this particular case. Now, let me go into mindsets of police officers involved in shootings, okay, prior to, during, and there's a couple things that come out. Now, in this case here, well, we kind of know that this case is not racially motivated. In my estimation, you had 2 officers firing, 1 black, 1 white, so we can't lean either direction in that regard. So, however, even though we can't lean in that direction, there have been past cases where one can say that there's a thing that in policing deals with what they call unconscious racism, where a person, it's not in policing, I'm sorry, it's in sociology and psychology, that talks about people who have unconscious racial tendencies. And the theory is that most of us suffer from some form of that, one to some degree or the other, where we prejudge people because of their color and their race, and we all kind of harbor those things. And oftentimes those things can be manifested on our jobs. And so that's one issue, although it's not apparent in this particular case. There's two, is being unfamiliar with the people in the neighborhood. That's important, that officers be familiar with the people in the neighborhood. I can tell you, working in certain neighborhoods, I knew everybody's family. I knew their sons. I knew if their sons were in jail. I knew if their sons, I just knew, that's just part of the job, being working in a neighborhood, that you know everybody. Being trained generally on issues, on how to respond to certain cases and de-escalate them, and not specific cases, okay? And that has to do with the different types of scenarios that you'll find yourself in as a police officer, and how you respond to those situations to de-escalate those situations. Bringing emotions to a particular situation. You can tell just from what I saw that the officers were scared. And it seemed to me that for a second there, they were suffering from tunnel vision, at least the initial officer, and the second officer just followed. Basically, one was in front of the other. If you go back and look at the video and you look at the illumination of the night scope, infrared, you can see that they're together, but one is slightly behind the other one. So we know one had a different vantage point than the other police officer in terms of what he saw. Okay. And so with them both firing, they both now have to justify why they fired. One officer will probably say, the only reason I fired is because my partner said the guy had a gun. And so I returned fire as well, even though he did not or may not have seen Mr. Clark with a weapon. That very well may be the case. In this case here, I tend to think that's what happened. The us against them, citizens always feel in urban areas that the police have pretty much taken over their communities, and it's been an us against them situation. And the police officers feel the same way. I can tell you that from talking to police on the street. A lot of police officers are unfamiliar with their own policies. I can tell you that right now. I can ride down the streets of Baltimore City right now, and I can quote policy 824, which is the same policy I quoted that deals with the body-worn cameras. And I will tell you that a lot of them probably would not be familiar with the operations of the camera, when to turn them on, when to turn them off, what are the other issues that the body cameras, you have to deal with them when you have them on. You'd be surprised, okay? Just because a person is out there with a uniform on does not mean, by no stretch of the imagination, that they are familiar with all the policies in their department. And they should be familiar with policies that are routine, meaning that certain acts that they do every day on an 8-hour shift are routine acts and are covered under departmental policy. And if you're not familiar with those, then something is wrong with you as a cop on the beat, and you probably need to find another profession. The next thing, you have officers that bring the vigilante mentality to work, where they feel is that they can be the judge and the jury in cases, and execute individuals on the street, and hide behind the law in terms of justification. And this is how a lot of officers get caught up when they try to use vigilantism as a means to say, well, he deserved it, or he should have stopped when we said stop, so therefore he deserved it. That's not how policing goes. If anyone that types to me that nonsense, again, I've seen that type to me once before, where they said, well, he should have stopped running. Well, there are a number of reasons why a person would be evading the law. And a lot of them have to do with historical issues that deal with young black men in the cities. A lot of them have to do with, quite frankly, being scared because of the occupation of some police forces in American cities, where, particularly in Baltimore, where people, I went to certain areas and communities where I could usually have conversations with people in the area. Just recently, particularly after the Freddie Gray case, and those folks didn't even want to talk to me. They didn't want to talk to me. So that told me just how much of an impact that the local police department had in those communities in terms of basically scaring people to death not to cooperate with anybody. So those things do exist. And because you might live in rural America and may not ever be exposed to that kind of thing, trust and believe. If you want, send me an email. make arrangements to get a hotel here in Baltimore, and I'll be more than happy to give you a tour of the city, both in the daytime and at night. Anywhere I'll take you. You just tell me where you want to go. If you want to go see where The Wire was taped at, I'll take you there. If you want to go see where Freddie Gray was killed and where the officers, Western District is, in the area he was killed, in the projects, I'll take you there. I'll take you anywhere that you want to go just to show you the realities of urban life in the city and in this particular city. So, having said that, that way you'll get a better perspective and not just watching it on TV or listening to somebody who's never been to this city to comment on something that they have no idea what transpires in this city on a day-to-day basis. Just recently on the morning show today in Baltimore on 1090 radio, there was discussion about a not a city councilman, I think it was a county councilman, I believe, I'm not sure. They made a statement about whether or not a person would rather come down to Baltimore City at nighttime. And, you know, a lot of people were upset that he made that statement. And I understand why they might have been upset why he made the statement. Some of the things he said in that statement are true. Some of those things he said in that statement are not true. However, I wish I would have been in that crowd, because had he offered me $100 or $1,000, then I'd have sat downtown in my car or on Pennsylvania North Avenue at 1 or 2 in the morning, listened to the radio, talking to the people on the corner all night long, and earned my money the next day. And again, if you want to go with me downtown in Baltimore at those times, all you have to do, I have an attached email here at the end of this, on this particular channel, and we can set up to meet with no problem. So I can give you that experience. I'm going to leave it at that. The next thing has to do, I talked about the bring unfamiliarity to police situation, bring emotion and talent testing, and then bring it from people. Okay, so I covered some of those things that go on in the officer's mindset, depending on the officer's training, depending on the neighborhood he or she works in, and other things. One of the other issues I discussed in that first video, part 1, had to do with these two officers' prior experience in law enforcement working elsewhere. Again, I reiterate that that's going to bear a huge issue here in this particular case when we get to learn why those officers left those police departments. As you recall, the officer in the Tamir Rice case, who was fired behind the Tamir Rice murder, it was found that this officer wasn't fit to be a cop in another jurisdiction, and yet the city of Cleveland decided to hire him on. So we wanted to know, why and how those decisions made to bring on lateral transfers, is what they call them in the industry. When an officer goes from one police department to another, law enforcement agency to another, it's called a lateral move. And so, we'll learn more about that as it goes along. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so I've covered the things I want to talk about in this case in terms of this particular shooting being unjustified. Now, a lot of you might say, well, Mike, you're jumping to conclusions, but you know what? I have enough experience in these cases over the years, and over 30-some years, that it almost seems that I could tie a blindfold around my face and kind of just listen to the case itself and can kind of come close to making certain certain decisions about how this case unfolded and why it would be unjustified and why it would not be unjustified. And again, these officers legally may meet the burden of it being a justified shooting as time goes on, but they may not make that burden because there's not a legal burden in terms of whether or not they'll be let go from the police department. It's just a violation of departmental policy. And that's all you have to do, pretty much, is to violate departmental policy. And if it's an egregious violation, they can terminate you. And so, that remains to be seen. We'll see what this police department will do. There's also some other folks that are talking about an outside investigation. I think the mayor has called for an outside investigation. And so, once again, we're tying up taxpayers' dollars as always when police departments screw up, where, to get to the bottom of the truth, we have to spend millions of dollars to get to the truth, if we ever get there. And it's playing out over and over and over again. And this is why you've had the Department of Justice come in, many police departments, over the past several years, because these incidents let me tell you something. The Department of Justice would have never got involved in their first cases years ago had it not been a problem. And so for those of you who don't think it's a problem, then you contact the Department of Justice so they can tell you that there's a problem in policing and law enforcement in the United States of America. There would be no reason for them to have mandates against certain police departments to start following the law and the Constitution of the United States. I love the Constitution of the United States. All you got to do is just follow it. If you want to be in law enforcement, just do your job, follow the Constitution, follow your departmental policies, and you won't end up in situations like this where you end up losing your job and your livelihood and end up maybe taking somebody's life that didn't warrant that particular taking. So that's all I got to say. That's all I got to add now. I'm not going to do a part 3 to this. I'll probably move on to something else. However, if something major develops out of this particular case, I will be back on to talk about it. My name is Mike McCormick. I'm with Advanced Criminology here in Owings Mills. I want to thank you for your time this evening.